Okay, hello everybody. Today's lesson is about cladograms, otherwise known as evolutionary trees. So here are our goals for today. Okay, so we're defining these terms here. We also want to be able to understand how to read and interpret evolutionary trees. So our agenda is going to be, we'll complete the aim and do now in your guided notes. So we'll have a Google Doc for that, just like yesterday. So review this agenda and goals. We're going to watch this video right here, and then we're going to complete the guided notes, answer some Regents questions, and do a summary. Remember to click turn in when you're done with your assignment. Okay? All right, to start off, when we talk about evolutionary trees, I want you to think about the tree of life. Right? So you're probably familiar with this. This is just showing over time how organisms have evolved, right? So we're starting with the simplest organisms and they branch out, so to speak, right? One leads to another through common ancestry. We have, if we trace way back, many, many, many ancestors of all different species that have come before us. And that's what the theory of evolution explains to us in terms of our origins and really how we got some of the traits that we have. Okay? All right, so your guided note should look something like this, where you're gonna type in the aim, and then you're gonna type in the answer for the do now. Anytime you see a blank, make sure you type in. Okay, so it's gonna look something like this. Okay, so make sure you have that out in front of you. All right, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, here's our aim. What are cladograms or evolutionary trees? Okay, so make sure you write that down. Also, the do now. You don't have to write the question, please just write the answer. Take a look at this picture here. According to this, which variation in the beetles is best adapted for this particular environment? Explain why. Okay, so I'll give you a chance to answer this and go ahead and pause the video. Okay, hopefully by this time you have written down your aim or typed in your aim, and you've also given the do now a shot. Okay, so what you should see here is that the bird is preferring the green beetles. So each time the beetles reproduce, the birds continue to eat the green ones. So in other words, the green beetles are at a disadvantage. Their green color variation makes them get eaten. So the ones that have a better chance of survival are the brown ones. So these brown beetles are over time surviving and therefore reproducing more often. So what you see at the end is mostly or really all brown beetles because the green ones have gotten eaten. Okay, so the brown beetles are better adapted for this environment because they're not getting eaten by the predator. Okay, so again, the brown beetles are better adapted to this environment because they are not getting eaten by the predator. Okay, so that's a review of natural selection. Remember, that's sort of the same as survival of the fittest. Darwin did not use that phrase, but it basically means the same thing. Okay, so let's put this in full screen. All right, now again, here's the tree of life, just a little closer so you can see it. Remember, life begins with very, very simple single-celled organisms like bacteria. Over time, bacteria have continued to evolve, and there's really thousands of species of bacteria alive now. They're still around, but some of these bacteria are no longer around because they changed. They evolved, and we have fungus, we have mammals like us, animals, plants, all sorts of things that have come from what is thought to be just a single common ancestor way back in time. Okay, so that's the idea here. Now, what I want you to write down is this definition of cladogram. So go ahead and take a moment and fill this in. Remember, you can pause the video. Okay, so what this is saying is that, again, a cladogram is the same as evolutionary tree. We're showing evolutionary relationships and also common ancestors among species. Okay, look at this evolutionary tree in your notes, or if you're writing it on paper, go ahead and just draw this. Very simple, just draw a straight line, label A. Then you have a branch coming off down here, label C, and a branch coming off here, label B. Now, in your Google Doc, you're going to see this picture and then this line. Time is already marked for you. What you're going to do is just type in present up here. So A, B, and C are present. They're at the present day. And then past, you're going to put down here. So as you go across this line, you're going from the past to the present. Okay, so that's how you read this. All right, now, you should have this cladogram already. Again, you can, if you're writing this, mark this down, mark this up. So A, B, and C are actually representing different species. Now, remember, we put time over here. Now, what you should recall is that we just saw this. These are present day species, meaning they're alive today. Now, these species didn't just come from nothing. They came from what's known as common ancestors. You've seen this term before. Now, here's another way of showing it. These species here, you trace back, and where they connected on this branching diagram, they had a most recent common ancestor. So you see species A and species B shared a common ancestor right here. Now notice species C has a different branching pattern than A and B. A and B converge right here. They come together more recently. Now, if you go further back in the past, both A and B have this common ancestor, which came from a second common ancestor. Now, this second common ancestor gave rise to A and B on the one hand, right? It changed into this, then it changed into A and B. And the second common ancestor, the older one, also gave rise to species C. So you see that first, this ancestor branched into C, and it branched into this. Now this branched a second time into A and B. That's how to read this. You read basically from the bottom up. So what you start with is the oldest organism. Okay, so the oldest organism is down here, and you just work your way up until you get to each of the species. Okay, now so what you should see, again, the oldest organisms are at the beginning of the tree. They're at the very bottom, and that's where you start. Now, the place where two branches meet are circled right here. The branch for A meets with the branch for B. These are the common ancestors, right? You can also see this branch meeting with the branch for C. Okay? Now, the letters are different species. We have A, B, and C representing different species. So we're showing A and B have a most recent common ancestor here. A and C have a most recent common ancestor down here. Okay? All right, let's continue looking at this. And now let's sort of interpret this. Okay? Now, again, we established what each component is. What I want you to do is analyze the pattern. So species A shares a more recent common ancestor with species B, right here, than with species C. Okay, so you can see A is closer to B through here than it is to C, right? A connects with B right here, but A connects with C way down here. Therefore, species A is more closely related to species B, right? They share a more recent common ancestor. So since A and B have a recent common ancestor right here, they share one or more inherited genes, right? So whatever ancestor this was, it passed on genes to A. It may have passed on some of the same genes to B. Now keep in mind, they're different species, so of course, their genes do continue to change over time. They're different enough to make different species. Otherwise, this would have branched just straight into one line. But you see how they became different at some point. So some of their genes changed, but many of them were actually inherited by a common ancestor. Okay? Now, how do scientists actually determine where to place these species? So it comes down to DNA. You can look at how they match their DNA, or homologous structures. So that's when you have like similar bones. For example, whales were kind of similar to maybe even human hands, whale flippers and human hands. We have very similar bones that make up this anatomy. And what you see is that it most likely came from a common ancestor. It's not a coincidence. You could also look at fossils. Remember that we studied whales a little bit. And we saw how in the past there have been fossils of whale-like ancestors that walked on land. And you see evidence of that because the whale now still has pelvic bones within its body, even though they're not needed. You should recall that's a vestigial structure. Vestigial structure is no longer needed, but it's still there because of the common ancestors. We also looked at embryos. That's embryology. If you compare embryos, you can see that no matter what organism, humans, fish, chicken, all have eyes, we all have tails at one point in development. So we all shared common ancestors. Okay, so what scientists did here is they plotted these different organisms based on all this data, and this is what they came up with. Okay, so the camel's way out here. Notice this is the oldest down here. Branches into the camel on the one hand, and all this other stuff on the other hand. Now, continuing from the bottom, this branch led to either the peccary, which is similar to a pig. Okay, so they shared a common ancestor here. Then it also continued to branch and over time gave rise to the present day hippo, which shared a pretty recent common ancestor with the modern day whale. Now, if we continue across time to present day here, the deer shares a pretty recent common ancestor with the cow. Okay, so let's continue to look at this. So according to the diagram, you just want to match up the most recent common ancestor. So go ahead and pause. You're going to type in pig, hippo, or cow and match them up to deer, peccary, and whale. Okay, so type in each of the three organisms that matches based on this diagram. Take a moment, pause, and complete that in your notes. All right, so hopefully what you've came up with here is, well, first off, that the camel's way off. It's not really closely related to anything here. But the deer is here. You should see it connects closely with the cow, whereas the peccary connects closely with the pig. And lastly, the whale connects closely with the hippo. Now, I don't want you to read it left to right, even though it happened to work out that way. What you actually have to do is look at from the bottom up. The reason why the pig and the peccary are closely related is because they branched right here. The reason why the hippo and the whale are closely related is because they branched here. And the reason why the deer and the cow are closely related because they branched here. Okay, so there are the answers. Make sure you get deer with cow, peccary with pig, and whale with hippo. Okay. All right. Now, here's another diagram. They can show it all sorts of different ways. Notice there are like curved lines here instead of the straight lines we saw. But it's still going from the past all the way to present day. Now, what do you think a line that doesn't reach the present would represent? When you think about species D, what happened to species D? Look at where it stopped. Present day is way up here where species E is. But D just kind of ended. It didn't reach present day. So, well, what we see here, before we answer this question is, first of all, species E has survived to present day. Species B, however, is not alive in present day, right? It only existed up to here, right? Some point in the past. But it's showing it's the most recent common ancestor of species C, right? B gave rise to C. And lastly, the point where we start is the oldest organism. Species X, way back in the past here, is the common ancestor of all these species in the diagram. So X branched into B, branched into D, branched into E, and then after branching into B, that gave rise to C, right? So ultimately, everything came back to species X. Now, species X would be happy to see maybe that species E is still alive, but species X might not be happy about species D. What this is showing here is that since it's not alive to present day, is that the species has gone extinct. So whenever you see on a diagram that a branch just ends abruptly, the species is extinct. Okay, so species D is extinct because the branch ended. Now, extinction means all of the species no longer exists. all of a species no longer exists. And this means that there's not a single individual left for that species. Now, this has happened actually in modern times. This is a bird called the great auk. It's actually a type of penguin. This penguin actually used to be alive in the North Atlantic. That's very close to us, right? Right along the East Coast, around Staten Island, is the Atlantic Ocean, and we are in the Northern Hemisphere. So these penguins used to be around very close to us. But in the 19th century, and remember, 19th century means the 1800s, there was widespread hunting of this bird. So what it actually led to was such a degree of hunting that the birds couldn't sustain their population anymore. There weren't enough birds to go around to um, mate and reproduce. They didn't survive. All of them died out. And so what this is saying is the article is about how human hunting drove the great auk to extinction. They drove them extinct, meaning that they've hunted them so much that there's no longer the great auk. Now, this seems like a really sad story, and maybe it is, or maybe it's like, oh, so what? We're missing the great auk, but we have so many other birds. Now, what's so critical about this is that when you have extinction, you can never get that back. That's billions of years of evolution that have now just been erased. So that's what's so awful about extinction is that you have all this evolution that's occurred, and that specific species is no longer around, right? So extinction is kind of a sad thing. There are many, many species that humans try to preserve, right? We preserve or we conserve, so we want to keep them alive. Now, if you want to read more on this, I attached the article from this link into the assignment, so you can go ahead and read that on your own. It's not an assignment, it's additional for your own interest. If you find yourself very interested in species going extinct, if you like animals, you like the environment, then I encourage you to go look at this. Okay? All right, now, question for you. Suppose all of the Himalayan tree frogs have died in the Himalayan mountains and no longer can be found there. However, some have been spotted in cities at the base of the mountain. Right? So picture this mountain, and all along the mountain, there's no longer tree frogs, but at the base, along this city, there are still some tree frogs. What I want you to answer is this species extinct? Why or why not? Just go ahead and pause the video and answer this question. Okay, so hopefully what you've come up with is the answer is no. The species is not extinct because there are still some Himalayan tree frogs alive. So remember, in order for something to go extinct, every single member of the species has to have died off. Here, the species has not gone extinct because there are still some Himalayan tree frogs alive. Okay, so just because from one region something has died off doesn't mean that it's extinct. All right, now here's some causes of extinction. We talked about how extinction is like an unpleasant thing. One of them is just if there's no variation. Now, again, think back to crops. Farmers producing tons and tons of, for example, corn or soy or almonds, right? For example, there are huge, huge orchards of almond trees. They actually they produce like this nice white flower, and once the flowers get pollinated by honeybees, the flowers then produce the almond, which is basically a fruit. I know we consider it a nut, but it's really in biology considered a fruit. Now, all of those almond trees are going to look exactly the same. In fact, maybe I can even pull up a picture of almond trees in California, right? So there are these giant orchards of all the same exact trees. So here's a good picture showing that because essentially this is all the same exact tree over and over and over, right? So I'm trying to just get this picture by itself. So let me see, open image, a new tab, here we go. Okay, so here we go. Giant orchards of almond trees. All of these are basically exactly the same. Now, what actually does happen, and it's a huge problem for this industry, is that disease strikes here and it's going to strike them all, right? If they're all exactly the same, they're susceptible to the same diseases. So if there's no variation, this puts the species at risk of going extinct. If something comes in and they're vulnerable to whatever it is, if they're vulnerable to a sudden new pathogen, they're susceptible to sudden cold temperature or sudden flooding. If there's no variation, then they're all going to die, right? It's all or nothing. That's what that means. So variation in a species could prevent extinction. Now, another thing here, a changing environment can absolutely cause extinction. This is in fact why no variation could cause extinction. If the environment changes, some of the members may not be able to survive that change, right? So we've seen plenty of examples now of, for example, there are new areas of drought. And drought is, of course, when there's not enough rain in a region, and if the region's not getting enough rain, the plants don't have enough. If those plants die, then the organisms that feed on it die. So if there's a sudden change where there's suddenly lots of drought, that could cause extinction. Or you could have a changed environment, right? The environment changed, and what you end up lacking is adaptation, rather. Okay, so this is basically the same idea. If you're not adapted to this new environment, then you may die off. Okay. All righty. Okay, so that's really about it for these notes. So we're going to do a recap in a moment, but first let's look at your assignment. So we have two parts here. First of all, make sure you finish the guided notes along this way. What I want you to do is answer 5 regions questions and then complete a summary. Now, if you're doing this in the Google Doc, all of this is already there. Just complete it and turn it in Google Classroom. If you're choosing to do this on paper, that's fine. In the end, just take a picture of your notes and upload that picture to this assignment. Okay, so like right now, if you're on paper, go ahead and number your paper 1 through 5. Leave some spaces, and those are going to be your regions questions. And then we're going to do the summary. Okay, so here's a quick recap. First off, remember evolutionary trees, same as cladograms, they show relationships through like this branching pattern, right? So common ancestor gave rise to 2 different species, and that's what that shows. When you have common ancestors, if you trace back like maybe both species, for example, like have similar bones, like we've seen. They inherited that through the common ancestor because they passed on those genes. Okay, remember present day species appear at the top of your diagram, and all the extinct species are ones that just sort of abruptly ended. They ended and like they're not continuing into present day. Extinctions when all members of the species die off, right? They don't just die off from a particular region. There's none left in the world. And extinctions caused by lack of variation, like in a farm, sudden changes like lots of drought, or failure to adapt to a changing environment. Okay, so if you're filling out the Google Doc, go ahead and you're all set here. Go ahead and go to the Google Doc. If you're doing this on paper, let me give you the questions now here. Or you could open that on your computer if you want. Okay, all right, so for many of you, have a great day, thank you. And again, if you're doing this on paper, let's go ahead and look at these questions. Okay, all right, here's the first one. Okay, so you can go ahead and pause the video and then give this a shot. Okay, so I'm just going to put up the question. We're not going to go over it, and then let's go ahead and complete this. Okay, here's the next one, the same diagram. Here's the question. Again, pause, give this a shot. Okay, here's the third question, same diagram. Here it is, pause, give it a shot. Okay, here's the fourth question, different diagram, right up here. And here's your question. Go ahead, pause, give this a shot. Okay, and lastly, here's this region question. Same diagram as number 4. Here's your question. Go ahead, pause, give it a shot. Okay, so those are the regions questions. Now let's move on to the summary. Let's skip that. Evolutionary trees. Directions are to complete these sentences down here by adding additional information. Okay, so here's an example. My teacher gave us so much homework today. For example, comma, we have to read 20 textbook pages and then write an entire essay. Okay, so what you're doing is writing in like this part in bold. Okay, so look at this evolutionary tree. There's time here. A is there, and it has all these different letters labeled. Okay, so you're going to read these sentences and then complete them. Evolutionary trees can show common ancestry among species, for example, then complete it. Number 2, cladograms, evolutionary trees, can show what species are alive today. In particular, and go ahead and complete it. And lastly, some species in the tree can be extinct. Specifically, go ahead and complete that. Okay, so once you're done with this summary, again, go ahead, you're writing this down or you have it in the Google Doc, take a picture, upload that to our assignment. Okay, so thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have an awesome day, and see you again next time.